Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President, and I thank the senator from Florida. Madam President, we hear a lot about tax breaks, tax loopholes around the United States Senate. I want to talk about a tax loophole today, a big one, that's on its way out. It's a $23 billion tax loophole. And it's not a loophole in the tax code of Washington, D.C. It's a loophole in virtually every state in the country. It's a loophole that prefers some taxpayers over other taxpayers. It subsidizes some businesses over other businesses. And it's a loophole that, because of that, caused tax rates in states to be higher, and it caused states to have less money to fund the universities or the state parks or the schools or the other expenses that are legitimate in the operation of a state. I say it's a tax loophole that's on its way out because after 20 years, Senator Enzi of Wyoming and Senator Durbin of Illinois have combined with a piece of legislation that is rare in Washington, D.C. It is only 10 pages long. It is very simple. It's a states' rights piece of legislation that gives each state the right to decide for itself whether or not to collect its state sales tax from everybody who owes it. Whether that person buys a pair of cowboy boots in Nashville or whether it buys a pair of cowboy boots from Amazon online. Senator Enzi and Senator Durbin introduced the Marketplace Fairness Act 4 weeks ago. It had 5 total Republican sponsors and 5 total Democratic sponsors. I am one of those sponsors. This is the bill that solves the problem of the online sales tax loophole, the one I described a little earlier. I mentioned cowboy boots. Let me describe what I'm talking about in practical terms. I called the owner of the Nashville Boot Company a couple of weeks ago. His name is Frank R-Wyo. He sold boots online, and he sells them to people who walk into his store there in West Nashville. When he started the company, almost all of his boots were sold online. Here's what he says is happening to him today. People come into the Cowboy Boot Company in Nashville, and they try on cowboy boots. And they find a pair they like, and then they go home and buy the cowboy boots online in order to save the state sales tax. Now, they owe the sales tax. Many people don't know they owe it, but they owe the sales tax just as much if they had bought the boots at the cowboy boot store there in Nashville. But they don't pay it. And why is that? It's because under the state law, when Frank Harwell sells a pair of cowboy boots in his store in Nashville, he collects the sales tax, sends it to the state. But under the law, the Supreme Court said 20 years ago, the state of Tennessee or the state of Missouri or the state of Washington, any other state, couldn't require Amazon or an out-of-state seller to collect the same sales tax. They had a reason for doing so, and it was a good reason. They said that it was so complicated to do it that it put a burden on interstate commerce. But at the same time, the Supreme Court invited the United States Congress to fix the problem. And by fixing the problem, that means the Congress could act in order to create a fair way for states to require retailers who are out of state to collect the same sales tax that retailers on Main Street collect. Over that 20 years, the online sales tax loophole got to be a big loophole. It subsidizes some businesses at the expense of others, and as I said earlier, prefers some taxpayers at the expense of others. Last week, the Hudson Institute, a generally conservative organization, released a new report that explains how the subsidizing of out-of-state sellers works and how the federal government, those of us in Washington, are keeping states from closing this loophole. They conclude, Hudson does, that this online sales tax loophole is distorting the marketplace, and I urge my colleagues to take a serious look at the Hudson Institute report. Governors and legislators are up in arms because they're being deprived of the right to enforce their own sales tax law. This is a little different loophole, actually a little worse one. Usually, loopholes are written into the law. Those are the kind we're trying to change in our tax reform proposals in Washington. This is a tax that's already owed. This is a tax that's already owed that governors and legislators want to collect. And they're used to pay for the things that states need to pay for or to reduce a tax. Or in the state of Tennessee, which has a very high sales tax, if the state was allowed to collect sales tax from everybody who owes it, well, then we might postpone the day of a state income tax, which are probably the three most hated words in tax vocabulary in Tennessee. I said when Senator Enzi and Senator Durbin introduced their bill that I believe they had solved the problem, and that if I were an out-of-state retailer or an online retailer, I would begin to make plans to collect that sales tax just as Main Street collectors collect it today. And many have. For example, Amazon, which had opposed for a long time this kind of legislation because, in their view, it was too uncomplicated for them to figure out what the tax might be, changed their mind and said that the Enzi-Durbin bill is a good bill and Amazon supports it. That's not all. Mississippi Governor Haley Barbour, strong conservative Republican governor, chairman of the Republican Governors Association, wrote a letter on November 29, and I'd like to quote it. Quote, "In the early days of the internet," Governor Barbour said, "the complexities of collecting state sales taxes across thousands of state and local sales tax jurisdictions were major obstacles. The technology simply didn't exist to expect startups to comply with the various tax compliance rules in every part of the country. But today, e-commerce has grown, and there's simply no longer a compelling reason for government to continue giving online retailers special treatment over small businesses who reside on main streets in Mississippi and the country." Governor Barbour continues, "The time to level the playing field is now, as there are no effective barriers to complying with state sales tax laws." Now, here's what Governor Barbour is saying. 20 years ago, we didn't have the kind of software and information we do today. But if I want to know what the weather is in Maryville, Tennessee, where I live, I just put in weather and my zip code, 37886. Under this new bill and under the technology that exists today, states will be required to give to out-of-state retailers or online retailers the software that will permit them to do the same thing. If I order a pair of cowboy boots, well, they can put in my name, the cost of the boots, the zip code, and the software will compute the tax and even find a way to send it on to the state. It'll be just as easy, or maybe even easier, for the out-of-state retailers to collect the sales tax that's owed as it will be for Cowboy Boot Store selling it out of the front door in Nashville. The National Governors Association sent a letter last week saying that the Enzi-Durbin bill represents a, quote, common sense approach that will allow states to collect taxes they are owed, help businesses comply with different state tax laws, and provide fair competition between retailers that will benefit consumers, unquote. Last week, the Judiciary Committee in the House of Representatives held an oversight hearing to discuss all three bills that have been introduced to address this issue, and there was a lot of good discussion. I want to share a few things that were said, and I hope we can have a similar hearing in the Senate soon. Mike Pence of Indiana, one of the leading conservatives in Congress, a fellow who knows a tax when he sees one, said, quote, "I don't think Congress should be in the business of picking winners and losers." Congressman Pence continued, "Inaction by Congress today results in a system that does pick winners and losers." Congressman Pence also talked about something I want to make sure my colleagues understand. The Enzi-Durbin bill is not talking about taxing the internet. It's not talking about creating a new tax. As far as the internet access tax goes, the Senate debated that a few years ago. I was in the middle of that debate, and I was in the middle of the solution that imposed a moratorium on the internet access tax. That law is still there. We're not talking about an internet access tax. Neither are we talking about a new tax. We're talking about the plain old state sales tax that already exists. And it's very hard to imagine how anyone can say Collecting a tax that is already owed is a new tax. Governor Barbour and Congressman Pence are correct. 20 years ago, the technology didn't exist. Today it does. About the only ones complaining are the taxpayers and businesses that enjoy being subsidized by other taxpayers and other businesses, and that, in our opinion, is not correct tax policy. As Republicans, I believe our party should oppose government policies that prefer some taxpayers over others, or some businesses over others. As Republicans, I believe we should support states' rights. And our bill does that by giving the state the right to make this decision about how to collect taxes. Do you want to collect taxes from everybody who owes the tax, or do you not want to? Do you want to prefer some businesses, out-of-state businesses over in-state businesses, or do you not want to? Do you want to collect the tax and reduce tax rates or spend the money on services? That's up to the states. These sentiments are also shared by the late William F. Buckley and Al Cardenas, chairman of the American Conservative Union. 10 years ago, William Buckley, who many people see as the father of the modern conservative movement, wrote in the National Review, quote, "The mattress maker in Connecticut is willing to compete with the company in Massachusetts, but doesn't like it if the out-of-state businesses are, in practical terms, subsidized." And that's what the non-tax amounts to. Local concerns are complaining about traffic in mattresses and books and records and computer equipment, which ordered through the internet come in, so to speak, duty-free. That's William F. Buckley. And then Al Cardenas, the chairman of the American Conservative Union, a distinguished Florida citizen, the head of an outfit that's arguably as strong and influential as any conservative organization in Washington, said in his recent essay, quote, "There's no more glaring example of misguided government power than when taxes or regulations affect two similar businesses completely differently." Madam President, as I've said many times before, I believe the Enzi Durbin legislation solves the problem. I believe it's going to happen. I hope that out-of-state sellers and online sellers will move ahead to work with states to make voluntary agreements, as, for example, Amazon has in Tennessee, and begin to allow states to enforce their tax policy properly. Our bill is a remarkable feat in Washington, D.C. I've mentioned it before. I'd like to emphasize it again. It is only 10 pages long. It is only about allowing states to make a decision about whether they want to close a loophole, a tax loophole. It's about stopping the subsidization of some taxpayers over others. It's about stopping the subsidization of some businesses over others. I'm glad others are starting to share this view, and as more senators learn about the Marketplace Fairness Act and look at the options it gives each state, I hope and I believe we'll have more co-sponsors. 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, the bills that were introduced weren't adequate to solve the problem. Fortunately, today, Senator Enzi and Senator Durbin have solved the problem. I agree. Democratic senators agree. The chairman of the American Conservative Union agrees. The chairman of the Republican Governors Association agrees. Congressman Mike Pence agrees. It is a matter of marketplace fairness. Mr. President, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to have printed in the record the letter to which I referred from Mississippi Governor Barbour, a letter from the National Governors Association and the National Journal article published last week regarding the House Judiciary Committee hearing on this subject.
Without objection.
Madam President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.